Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by journalists. Does Prigozhin's downfall, forgive the choice of words, change much at home or on the battlefront? Our next guest suggests Putin is all the stronger for it. The Russian leader is going nowhere, and his troops are unlikely to budge much either. Our guest is Leonid Ragozin, a familiar figure with those of you who have travelled with us to Russia, Ukraine, or the Baltics. Hello and welcome, Leonid.
Hello, Nick. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us again. We're probably going to stick this talk to about 45 minutes, so please do get your questions in early. It's quite late where Leonid is at the moment, so we don't want to keep him up for too long. Let's just go back to what happened in June, Leonid. What on earth happened? How did this come about? We know about Prigozhin, we know about Wagner, its set up, its role in Ukraine and elsewhere, but how did it get to this?
Well, it was building for some time, and over the winter, as you know, the Prigozhin's force, the Wagner Group, was the key player in the war in Ukraine. The main story was about the Battle of Bakhmut, a small city in eastern Ukraine. And over the winter, the Prigozhin's troops were trying to capture it. And there was a very long saga, and the Russian and Ukrainian sides have different accounts with different versions explaining why it happened. But both sides are using the term meet grinder. Because loads and loads of both Russian and Ukrainian troops fell in this battle.
So it's essentially, I mean, talking about a difference over tactics. You've heard the phrase "meat grinder," just the enormous loss of life. I mean, this coming from Prigozhin, who didn't seem particularly sensitive to people losing their lives beforehand. But I guess what I'm driving at was something more than just about tactics.
Well, look, when the Russian side, when Prigozhin was talking about the meat grinder, and he also claimed that the meat grinder was the invention of General Surovikin, who is associated with Prigozhin in media stories. So from their point of view, or at least how they are trying to present it, meat grinder was something the Ukrainians were facing in Bakhmut. The idea was to have as many Ukrainian forces as possible in a small territory and basically exterminate them there. But of course, the Ukrainian narrative is quite opposite. So they're saying that the Russians were attacking, they were not counting their forces, and they were killing people for God knows what, for a small city that is not even strategically important, according to both sides. So there was a strange situation, but the outcome of this situation was that Prigozhin came into the center of media attention. He was increasingly outspoken and increasingly defiant throughout the winter and spring as his troops were advancing on the Ukrainian positions. He was becoming very critical of the chief of the general staff, of General Gerasimov, and the defense minister, Shoigu, and gradually he was talking all the time. He was talking every day, making video addresses, and he was also running this media empire, which was particularly strong on Telegram. Loads of Telegram channels that were spreading his narratives, and his narratives were, of course, they were anti-Ukrainian, but increasingly they were becoming anti-defense ministry. They were aimed at the defense ministry, and he was demanding ammunition. He was demanding weapons all the time. He kept claiming that he was undersupplied, although all the other troops were complaining about all the resources being pulled into Bakhmut. So yeah, eventually, what happened is that he felt that he probably was more important than defense ministry and the general staff.
I mean, just to come back on that, we know that Prigozhin rose to power because of his friendship with Vladimir Putin. But in terms of the Russian security apparatus and bureaucracy, would he be more allied with the GRU, the military intelligence?
Yeah, that's what experts on Russian secret services, such as Andrei Soldatov and Leonid Ragozin, have been saying from the outset, that hybrid forces like Wagner troops are the invention of military intelligence. Not just in Russia, on all sides, also in Ukraine. When you look at the supposedly Russian formations within the Ukrainian troops and volunteer battalions. So in the Russian situation, we're talking about this permanent competition between the GRU, between the main military intelligence agency inside Russia and the defense ministry. It goes back to the Soviet times. It's not something new. Hybrid forces, the convenient deniables that are used in various places, especially such places as Syria or Libya.
Yeah.
Potential.
But I mean, just bringing us to the point. I mean, it's pretty catastrophic when. I mean, this is an open rebellion. We know that, the fact. I mean, we don't know exactly why he stopped a few hundred kilometers short of Moscow, but he did. His. You know, I think it was no surprise to anyone that later his jet fell out of the sky. The question is, what's happened since? Because that was seen as a catastrophic challenge to Vladimir Putin's authority. How do you think he has reasserted himself afterwards?
Well, look, it felt pretty dramatic. Especially when it's not just the march in Moscow, but how they started shooting down Russian airplanes, and especially when they shot down the command airplane. But if you look attentively at Prigozhin's rhetorics, it was never aimed against Putin. He was very careful about not rebelling against Putin. And even when he started the rebellion, he was quite careful to articulate in the way that this is a rebellion against the defense ministry and against the general staff. So in terms of Kremlin's PR, Putin was staying outside of it throughout the whole thing. What really happened in terms of public opinion in Russia is that in June, during the month when the rebellion happened, before the rebellion, Prigozhin entered the top 10 most respected Russian politicians. His star was rising. He was becoming recognized by the Russian public, which didn't know much about him before that. He's more of a character of Western publications than of Russian media. But in June, he became recognizable because of the Battle of Bakhmut. Interestingly, one of the polling agency, the main polling agency, the most sort of trustworthy polling agency in Russia, Levada, was conducting a poll about the popularity of Russian politicians during the weekend when the rebellion happened. And the poll was conducted over 3 days. And then they published a breakdown by days. And it was clear from this breakdown, Friday, Saturday, and then Sunday, when the rebellion was completely suppressed, that this popularity bubble created by Prigozhin's media empire burst completely. He was no longer popular. And there was a lot of wishful thinking in the West at that point, and there were all those videos shown on major television networks of Prigozhin supporters greeting his troops in Rostov-on-Don, the city in the south, which he entered and practically occupied. However, there was zero support across Russia
But there didn't seem to be much opposition to him militarily on his way north.
Well,
or opposition among the crowds along the road.
No, there was. Look, there were certain the defenses of Moscow pretty much at the point where he stopped. So he stopped at the point where he would enter a real battle. That Russia was regions in Russia were not prepared to this eventuality. Well,
okay. Let's just look at the aftermath. Let
me just finish this. I mean, it's not something unique. I mean, we have the Congress of the United States occupied by a crowd of crazy rebels on the 6th of January. So these countries are never prepared to such eventualities.
Yeah, I suppose the comparison might be there between protesters with placards and tanks and aircraft, but there we go. So what's happened since then? There's been a pretty brisk clampdown in terms of I guess Wagner's forces are being dispersed, reintegrated into other parts of the armed forces. But we've also had another sort of prominent Kremlin critic, Igor Girkin, who I think just say a bit about Girkin because possibly people don't know about him.
Igor Girkin, who goes by his name Strelkov. He's the person who pretty much single-handedly started the war in eastern Ukraine in 2014, when his ragtag band of former military occupied the town of Slavyansk. And then from there, the insurgency, which was directed by Russia, quite obviously, spread all over the Donbas region. So he's a former FSB officer, but he is also a rogue, and he has very distinct political beliefs. He's the actual Russian imperialist, a very rare species, I must say, because he is genuine about it. He fought in Serbia during Balkan Wars, and he's a maverick.
Likewise, he'd been very critical of the Russian operations in Ukraine and published repeatedly on Telegram his own a day-by-day account of Russian failures and a sort of critique of Russian failures, which is quite useful for the Ukrainians. He was arrested. What's he been charged with?
Well, he was arrested in the wake of Prigozhin's rebellion. And he's been tolerated by the Kremlin for many years. The stuff he was saying on Telegram, I mean, every single line of it. If anything like that was said by a liberal politician, that liberal politician would be in prison immediately. But Girkin was tolerated for a long time. That he was saying those things are not particularly surprising because he represents the far-right opposition to Putin, the imperialist part of the far-right opposition, as opposed to ethno-nationalist part, which supported Ukraine in this war. And many of them fled to Ukraine and are now fighting on the Ukrainian side. Girkin is an actual imperialist, which makes him extremely marginal in Russia, and he holds no sway. But yeah, it was the problem was for the Kremlin, I guess, that he was he had his informants on the front line. He is a military professional. His Telegram channel was interesting. It was popular, and yes, it was extremely critical of the Kremlin. So I guess it is
Yeah.
It's definitely it is Prigozhin's rebellion which triggered finally his arrest. Something that was expected.
And Leonid, I guess the most obvious point is that Prigozhin was Putin's creation, and part of the way that he structured his own regime. And this is the man that has caused the most serious threat to his leadership.
Yeah, creation. When people talk about something being designed by the Kremlin, something being created by the Kremlin, I think we are underestimating the scope of chaos in the Kremlin and the spontaneity of the decisions that are being made, and figures that become permanent media figures. Like Prigozhin, are not necessarily the main movers and shakers. We can kind of trace the politicians, securitycrats to be precise, that were linked to Prigozhin, and those of them who were benefiting from what Prigozhin's media empire was saying, and who were sympathetic of Prigozhin in some way, or he was sympathetic of them. But that's something that has been left under the carpet, despite this enormous outburst that happened. Of this energy, of this conflict energy that existed within the Kremlin, we still don't know who were the main figures in the story. Prigozhin is an avatar. He's a media figure. What really happened, we will know in the future.
Okay, but and I saw you wrote in Al Jazeera a while back. I mean, sometime after the insurrection, that you actually thought that Putin was all the stronger for it.
Right. Yeah. There was something brewing up. There were interfactional fighting. And then it burst out. There was this attempt at rebellion, and there was a lot of hope in the West that it will somehow succeed, and it will lead to the downfall of the regime. But that didn't happen, and most importantly, what it showed, again and again, is that the last thing Russian public wants, the last thing Russian society wants, is a war on its territory, and that's the foundation of Putin's support. The fear of war, it's in the psyche. It's what drives the support of Putin, and it is what drives this very tacit and very conditional support of Putin's military adventures abroad.
I remember you saying a few years back that there was a kind of social contract that so long, in actually the reverse of what you're saying, that Putin had bought stability, that he'd bought economic stability and stability in terms of the lack of conflict, and yet he actually seems to have brought it far closer to Russian homes, and that economic prosperity, whilst it's there in the cities, is it's been threatened.
Well, there is no contradiction, at least from how he frames it. The way he frames it is that he continues to defend stability, and instability is out there in Ukraine. That's what the West does to us, and the Russians still think of the former Soviet people as us, and that's what will happen to us if we take the Ukrainian path, if we start sort of going in pro-Western direction, and if we don't defend ourselves. The idea that to defend itself, Russia should fight on the foreign territory, on enemy's territory, is quite ancient, and in particular drove Stalin's decision to sign the treaty with the Nazis. Ribbentrop-Molotov Treaty. It was largely based on this military strategy of fighting a war on enemy's territory. So it's at this point it feels the same, and it's something he can sell to the broad public, that we are preventing a war from coming to your homes.
I guess the next in line, the next most powerful independent figure might be Kadyrov in Chechnya. Just say a bit about him and what's happened to him recently.
Well, first of all, of course, Kadyrov is quite famous as an Instagram media figure. He's the leader of Chechnya, and he's a cruel dictator. But he is also an Instagram star, and he liked being an influencer. So because of Instagram, we know that he was physically changing over some months. He was growing bigger, fatter, and looking increasingly quite sick. And rumors, of course, started spreading that he was ill. And when somebody is ill, of course, there is a lot of Infowar actors who will start saying that he is terminally ill. You know, the chief of Ukrainian military intelligence has been saying it for 2 years, that Putin is terminally ill. He will die in a couple of weeks, in a couple of months. There are different versions. So we have a strange situation. The situation is definitely there. There is some commotion going on in the main in Kremlin's main clinic in Moscow. There are cars with Chechen number plates driving in and out. There are helicopters flying. Something is going on, and it involves the Chechens. Kadyrov disappeared uncharacteristically from view. He wasn't on Instagram. He wasn't attending meetings. So something was happening to him as well. And then the Infowar actors kicked in the absence of other information. And the main source for the rumors that Kadyrov died come from a dodgy Telegram channel called VCK OGPU. VCK and OGPU are the old 1920s, 1930s names of the KGB. So I mean, even the name suggests it's not something you should easily trust. However, because this is an anti-Putin channel, quite a few Western commentators are jumping on it again, because there is this expectation there is a magic wand. There's either Prigozhin will topple Putin.
So you wait and see. But the fact that the next most independent and powerful. I'm trying to think of the expression for him, but sort of he basically runs his own independent army and foot soldiers who are loyal to Putin. The fact that he's ill, we can't draw any conclusions yet. The next strong man that Putin is dealing with is actually Kim Jong-un. So the Vladimir Putin went off to meet the leader of North Korea at the Vostochny Cosmodrome. What was that all about? What do you think Putin was after there?
Well, this is about the war in Ukraine, and North Korea is, of course, a mass producer of ammunition of the Soviet type, and of weapons that Russia may need in Ukraine. So that was largely about that, and how the trip was choreographed. It was almost like Kim being on a shopping spree. He was visiting factories. He was visiting the space launch pad. He was checking out different missiles. In particular, he was interested in missiles, and even Putin commented on that. So that was quite clearly communicated by the Kremlin.
What I wondered was, I mean, I didn't think that the quality of North Korean artillery shells was that reliable, and even their rocket systems are not that reliable either. And my sense was that it was more of a geopolitical thing. Was that, you know, if you want to prolong this war, we've got friends in other tricky places too.
Mhm. Well, I don't think geopolitically. I don't think Putin would be investing so much of his time into simply, showing middle finger to the Americans. But the way I understand it, it was still largely about what both sides in the Ukrainian war are struggling with: the lack of ammunition, the amount of ammunition that both sides are using is unprecedented, and no economists, including the American economy, Western economists, were not prepared to so much ammunition being used. So everybody is tapping into various sources, and that's we know that the ammunition comes to Ukraine from places like Pakistan and African countries through American dealers. The Pentagon is working on. There was an interesting investigation in the New York Times recently about it. Similarly, Putin is looking out for sources, and North Korea is one obvious source.
Okay, I'd love to get everyone's questions. This recording is not going to go on for to the normal hour length. So if you want to get your questions in, please do get them in now. We read in the papers and we sort of read online that the battle for Ukraine is not going well. There's very little land being taken by the Ukrainians. There certainly hasn't been any land, or very little land, taken by Russia too. So there's a definite sense of stalemate. We were reading a figure just recently about, I think, the number of amputees in Ukraine has reached 15,000, which is more than the entire total that Britain suffered during the Second World War. Now, that might be a reflection on modern armaments and their ability to inflict damage on people, but the fact that it's had an impact on that kind of impact in such a short period of time is pretty horrendous. That's the news about Ukraine. What do you hear about those kind of injuries or those kind of losses in Russia?
Well, there is a huge contrast, and I communicate with various people in Ukraine and with lots of people in Russia. I have many friends in Ukraine because obviously I work there, when you talk to the Ukrainians, when you look at their timelines on Facebook, you inevitably see that almost every person who you know there in Ukraine has near and dear ones, relatives, friends who suffered in this war somehow. Either were killed or they were maimed. It's just the opposite in Russia. It's very unusual to encounter somebody who has been directly affected by the war. There are, of course, losses on the Russian side, which are being exaggerated by the Ukrainian side, which are also seem to be exaggerated by the Americans when they're saying.
So you currently think that the Ukrainian losses are far more substantial than the Russian losses?
Well, Ukraine doesn't report the losses. On Russian losses, at least we have the BBC and Media Zone are working on creating an estimate of Russian losses based on open sources. Based on open sources, that figure now stands at 31,000, but that's based on open sources, and the suggestion, at least by Media Zone, is that this figure should be almost doubled. They were talking about 47,000 back in May. So
Is that so deaths or deaths and injuries?
that's deaths. That's lethal losses. Yeah.
Deaths. Mhm.
So we can kind of more or less safely talk about 60,000.
So is that the fact that you're not hearing anecdotal stories? You aren't hearing anecdotal stories about it. There certainly has been reporting from Far Eastern regions, lots of places throughout Russia about deaths, and you can see photographs of the graveyards. I mean, is that a reflection just that it's not affecting Russian cities, the more cosmopolitan areas that you and I might have more contact with?
No, that's absolutely the fact. In Russia, the impact of the war is limited to very specific demographics, and that's the poorest, the most destitute people, and also people living in more remote regions. There is a lot of talk about ethnic minorities being disproportionately affected, but I'm not sure to which extent this is true, because people look at autonomies like Buryatia, and they don't understand that the ethnic minority in the title of this republic is also a minority in this republic, a small minority. So most of the servicemen from this republic would be also Russians. But there was a large number of prison inmates who were thrown into the battle. There were lots of poor people from villages, and these people are invisibles in Russia. They are not on social networks, and they're not really among the friends and relatives in the million-plus cities. The cities, about 20 cities in Russia that are most politically significant, the cities that can actually start a revolution and topple Putin.
Okay, so long as those cities are stable and prosperous, Putin's okay.
Yeah, Putin has been very careful to protect people from in those cities from not being affected, and we can see it also now that. We are now. Yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of the mobilization. Putin started back last fall. There were a lot of fear about this mobilization, and eventually, around 300,000 people were mobilized. What is happening now, a year after the mobilization, is that relatives of these people are complaining that their brothers and husbands are not being allowed to return back to their families, as they should be, even by law, even by the Russian law. But the Kremlin wants to keep them in the battle because it doesn't want to expand the pool of people that have been affected by the war. So that's a very cynical, but also clever policy aimed at preventing any kind of protest in Russia.
We'd love more of your questions, please. I've got a question just coming up from Alan Livingston. So if we get him up on the screen. Yeah, here we go, Alan. Please, Alan, put your question to Leonid.
Yes, I'm wondering, why did Putin allow private armies or private military to carry out foreign policy escapades, not only in Ukraine, but in countries in Africa like Chad, Mauritania, etc., and now have all these private armies now come under control of the Russian military establishment?
Good question, Alan.
Right. Private armies are not a Russian invention, and Wagner was modeled on Blackwater. Russia is quite often copycatting the West, and especially the Americans. So the idea behind Wagner was to create the Russian Blackwater. Why do you need Blackwater? Why do you need Wagner? Is because you need deniable forces. You need to do something you don't want to be responsible for as a government, before other governments and before your own voters and citizens. So that's why PMC Wagner was important for Putin. Putin's government does a lot of illicit stuff, a lot of stuff it doesn't want to advertise in various countries. There is this scramble for Africa going on between Russia, the West, and China. So of course, Russia needed a force like this. But then, yeah, the war in Ukraine made Wagner all the more important. Uh, uh, Again, because Putin was quite reluctant to use the regular army, because he was reluctant for this war to affect swathes of population.
Just bringing, because we've got to move on fairly quickly, Leonid. The issue, nevertheless, is that, without Prigozhin there was a vacuum, and Wagner have had enormous impact across Central Africa, for example. So the question was, who would lead them? Who would sort of coordinate that? They've had impact on at least 3 coups over the last 18 months. Who is going to take over?
Right. Okay. So what we have seen recently is that Deputy Defense Minister Yevkurov, an ethnic English, sort of like close to Chechens, he was traveling through Africa. And then another person who started traveling to Africa, who showed up in Libya. It's General Surovikin, the general who was dismissed after Prigozhin's coup, who was believed to be very close to Prigozhin, and also the general who is responsible for the Russian defenses in Ukraine that are not allowing the Ukrainian troops to advance as much as they wanted during this counteroffensive, which they proved quite efficient. So Surovikin, it seems like he's going to play a role in the future Wagner. And then other reports that are coming in is that Wagner might retain its structure and culture, but become a part of the Russian Guard. The Russian Guard is a absolutely separate structure. It is primarily created to fight domestic dissent, to fight against potential uprisings and protests inside Russia. It was initially a part of police, but it was heavily militarized. And its chief, Zolotov, General Zolotov, was very close to Putin. He keeps demanding that they were given, artillery and planes, that they become a separate army per se. So if he succeeds in getting Wagner, and then, our Russian Guard will look more like another army in Russia.
Excellent. Good question, Alan. Thank you very much for that. Lewis Tart from Down Under. Go ahead, Lewis.
Yeah, my question is really, because everybody keeps talking about the winter coming, and really looking at it from your perspective, is that going to advantage either side, or will it just bog everything down for a good 6 months?
Right. Well, that depends on what kind of winter we're going to have, and the main factor is how wet this winter might be, because that hampers the movement of hardware. And the idea behind the Ukrainian counteroffensive is that they, at some point, they managed to break through the Russian minefields and other defenses. And at this point, they can bring in into the battle all the expensive machinery they acquired from the West. And that's when they might be able to defeat Russia soundly. So winter is... It's unclear about the winter. Russians continued to fight through the winter, and they eventually seized Bakhmut last winter. Winter did not prevent them from advancing, although those advances were quite limited. The Ukrainians are now also talking that they will try to keep fighting in winter. What might be quite significant in this equation is that the Russians, actually yesterday, they renewed the campaign of the destruction of the energy infrastructure in Ukraine. They started strikes against the energy infrastructure in Ukraine. And that's significant because the heating season starts in a couple of weeks in Ukraine. It should start in the middle of October, but last year it probably started in November. Ukraine is this is crucial. People live in Soviet era apartment blocks, large apartment blocks. You can't live there without central heating. If this infrastructure is destroyed by Russian missiles, then Ukraine is facing a major humanitarian catastrophe, which the West will have to deal with. All those people will pour into neighboring countries. There were also reports that Russia was deliberately saving on its missiles. It was not using as many missiles as it did last winter. So again, it was an indication that they might be preparing for a major assault on the Ukrainian energy infrastructure this winter. So
let's say that the Ukrainians do get bogged down. Let's say they do have a terrible winter and a humanitarian crisis. What kind of settlement do you think the Russians or the Putin would be happy with?
Well, I think the most important for Putin is not the territory, but his demands about NATO and the demands about the demilitarization of Ukraine. So basically, I don't think he cares much about the territories he has occupied. He will keep them for sure, but I don't think he will want to advance much further, except for the small part of Donbass he hasn't occupied yet, and that's the agglomeration around Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. Otherwise, yes, he. The question for him is not about what we carve out from Ukraine, because keeping this territories also means investment, and I don't think they're quite keen to spend too much money on that. He wants Ukraine to be weak, without an army, and definitely not trying to enter NATO. He can potentially compromise on Ukraine entering the European Union, because that has never been a major priority for them. But
I thought that was the issue that caused the Maidan revolution.
Well, that's a popular. Well, I mean, it caused Maidan revolution, but again, it's a popular myth that it's the thing that's crucial for Putin. What's crucial is NATO, and the fear of NATO is that is what drove their reaction to Maidan revolution. So yeah, I think the question of NATO will be essential in the talks.
Okay, well, there's one last thing before we go, and that's what's happening in Nagorno-Karabakh. For those who don't know, the Armenians, the Armenians are being pushed back in Nagorno-Karabakh. That's the sort of enclave within Azerbaijan, and the Azeris launched a major offensive a few days ago, and essentially the Armenian forces within Nagorno-Karabakh have ceded to Baku's control. What's your? I mean, your belief is, you think that was instigated in part by the West? Did they encourage that? What do you think?
Well, if you read, go through the publications about Azerbaijan and Armenia in the Atlantic Council, which is the think tank closest to the NATO's apparatus, then yes, there was incitement. Quite a bit. To which extent that affects the thinking in the American presidential administration, I'm not sure. But Turkey, a member of NATO, is a major player and Azerbaijan is entirely dependent on the Turkish backing, as well as on Israeli military supplies, weapon supplies, and again.
Maybe your argument is that helps Ukraine somehow or other by bugging down Russia. I was a bit confused.
Well, again, that's not a big secret. That's what the Ukrainians are talking openly about, and now and before that, there should be a second front in the Caucasus for Russia to fight. The previous attempt was in Tbilisi when the opposition tried to depose the Russia-friendly government there in Georgia. And then now they have hopes again that Russia will get bogged down somehow in this war, but I don't think it will provoke Putin into meddling in this conflict. Putin in this conflict, the Kremlin has been extremely cynical, and they found themselves in a comfortable position that if, as many people expect, Azerbaijan will start ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh, as it did in previous war in 2020, then especially for the global South, it will be on the West. It will be on Turkey, a NATO member. It will be on the European Union, which proclaimed Azerbaijan its strategic energy partner in 2022, sorry, after the start of
It'll be the West's fault.
Yeah, so Putin will be framing it as the West's fault, and for the West it will be quite difficult to repel it.